The way the salesman sneered at the man in ragged clothes made Mitchell Parker's stomach turn. He had built his car dealership chain from nothing, starting with a single lot and growing it into 15 locations. Customer service had always been his top priority. But standing there, dressed in an old flannel shirt and worn-out jeans, he was seeing a side of his business he never expected. It had started with a string of complaints. Customers at this store, the second highest-grossing dealership in his company, had reported being treated poorly, especially if they didn't look wealthy. Mitchell had heard enough. He decided to see for himself, disguising himself not as an employee but as a customer. Since his face wasn't plastered all over the company's branding, and since he rarely visited individual locations, no one at this dealership had ever met him in person. Now, leaning against a sleek sports car, he watched the scene unfold. "Sir, I'd like to look at a used sedan," the man in the ragged clothes said, his voice quiet but firm. The salesman, a tall guy with slicked-back hair and an expensive watch, let out a scoff. "Buddy, you can't afford anything on this lot. Maybe try the junkyard down the street." Mitchell's jaw clenched. He noticed a young woman behind the front desk glance up, looking uncomfortable. She seemed like she wanted to intervene, but she kept her head down. The man in the old clothes didn't back down. "I have money," the salesman chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, sure. And I have a mansion in Beverly Hills." He turned away, waving dismissively. "I'm not wasting my time, man. We only deal with serious buyers here." Mitchell stepped in. "Hey, why don't you show the man what he asked for?" The salesman turned to him, giving him the same once-over he'd given the other man. His lip curled. "You another one looking for a car you can't afford?" Mitchell kept his voice steady. "Or maybe I just don't like seeing customers treated like garbage." The salesman rolled his eyes. "Look, man. I don't have time to play social worker. People like him don't buy cars. They waste our time, ask a million questions, and then walk out." The man in the ragged clothes shook his head. "I was going to pay cash, but I'll take my business elsewhere." Mitchell watched as he walked out, his dignity intact despite the insult. He turned back to the salesman. "You just lost a sale," the salesman shrugged. "Doubt it." Mitchell glanced toward the front desk. The young woman was still watching, her expression tense. He made a mental note of her. "Who's the manager here?" Mitchell asked. The salesman smirked. "That'd be Troy. But good luck getting him to care." Mitchell didn't like the sound of that. He walked toward the office in the back, but before he got there, the young woman from the front desk hurried over. "Sir," she said, her voice low, "if you're looking for a car, I can help you." She hesitated, glancing toward the salesman who was now chatting up a couple who had just walked in. "I saw what happened. I'm really sorry." Mitchell studied her. She seemed nervous but also determined. "What's your name?" "Rachel Lawrence," she said. "Rachel, do you see this kind of thing a lot?" She swallowed hard. "More than I'd like to admit." "How long have you worked here?" "A year," Mitchell nodded. "And the manager, Troy, doesn't do anything about it." Rachel hesitated, then shook her head. "He encourages it. He says we shouldn't waste time on broke window shoppers." Mitchell kept his face neutral, but anger simmered beneath the surface. This wasn't just a bad salesman. This was a toxic culture, and it started at the top. "Thanks for telling me," he said. Rachel looked uneasy. "Please don't say anything to them. If they know I talked—" "You don't have to worry about that," Mitchell assured her. She nodded, relieved, and went back to the desk. Mitchell took a moment to collect himself. This was worse than he thought. He had expected to find one bad apple, but it was clear this dealership had a bigger problem. He walked toward the manager's office, ready to see just how deep this went. Mitchell stepped through the office door without knocking. The space was cluttered, papers stacked carelessly on a desk, a half-eaten sandwich sitting next to a coffee cup stained from repeated use. Behind it, a man in his late 40s leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened. He barely glanced up before speaking. "If you need something, talk to one of the sales guys," he said, not bothering to put his phone down. Mitchell stayed where he was. "You're Troy." Now the man looked up properly, setting his phone down with a sigh. His eyes ran over Mitchell's worn-out clothes, and there was a flicker of irritation in them. "Yeah, what do you need?" Mitchell didn't answer right away. He glanced around the office, taking in the details. A framed plaque on the wall displayed sales numbers from previous years, but nothing recent. A whiteboard behind Troy's chair listed monthly goals, but there were no notes about customer service scores. It was clear where the priorities lay. "I was just on the floor," Mitchell said, keeping his voice even. "Saw one of your guys turn a customer away without even listening to him." Troy exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Let me guess, some guy dressed like he rolled out of a dumpster. People like that don't buy cars." "They waste time." Mitchell leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "He said he had cash." Troy snorted. "They all say that." Mitchell studied him. There wasn't an ounce of concern in his expression, no sign that he cared whether a sale had just walked out the door. That was more telling than anything else. "You ever verify that before deciding?" Troy shrugged. "Look, I don't run a charity, I run a dealership. You wouldn't believe how many people come in here just to sit in a car they'll never afford. If my guys wasted time on every single one, we'd never sell anything." Mitchell noted the way he said, "my guys." There was no mention of the customers, no indication that he saw them as anything other than obstacles between him and a commission. "You train them to treat people that way," Troy scoffed. "I train them to close deals. If someone walks in dressed like they've got money, we roll out the red carpet. If they don't, we don't waste our time." Mitchell let that sink in. "So if someone doesn't look rich, they're not worth respect." Troy frowned, finally seeming to realize this wasn't just a casual conversation. "Who are you anyway? You don't look like you're here to buy a car." Mitchell didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment feel heavier. "Do you know how many people have complained about this location in the last year?" Troy's frown deepened, but he didn't seem rattled. "People complain about everything. If we worried about every little thing, we'd never get anything done." Mitchell wasn't surprised by the answer. He had dealt with managers like this before, ones who saw problems as nothing more than background noise, something to ignore until they went away. "You ever wonder how many sales you've lost because of that attitude?" Troy rolled his eyes. "We're doing fine." Mitchell glanced back toward the showroom. Rachel was at the front desk speaking with a customer. The salesman from earlier was still on the floor, laughing with another employee. Whatever they were talking about, it wasn't work. "You think that's true?" Mitchell asked, nodding toward the floor. "That you're doing fine." Troy followed his gaze, then shrugged again. "We hit our numbers." Mitchell didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "That's all that matters to you?" Troy leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. "Look, I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I don't have time for lectures. If you're not buying a car, we're done." Mitchell held his gaze for a few seconds longer, then pushed off the doorframe. "We'll see about that." He walked out without another word, but his mind was already made up. This wasn't just about one bad salesman. It was the entire culture here, one that had been allowed to rot from the top down. As he stepped back onto the showroom floor, he caught Rachel watching him again. There was uncertainty in her expression, but also something else, hope. Like she wanted to believe someone would finally do something about the way things were. She didn't know it yet, but that's exactly what was about to happen. Mitchell walked back onto the showroom floor, his mind already made up. The toxic culture at this dealership wasn't just an accident, it was encouraged. That had to change, starting now. He crossed the floor toward Rachel's desk. She looked up from her computer, her fingers hesitating on the keyboard. "Do you know when the regional VP last visited this location?" Mitchell asked, keeping his voice low. Rachel glanced toward Troy's office, then back at him. "I don't think they ever have, at least not in the year I've been here." Mitchell nodded. That explained a lot. If no one from corporate had been paying attention, Troy had been free to run things however he wanted. "You said earlier that this happens a lot," Mitchell continued. "Do customers complain directly to you?" "All the time," Rachel admitted. "I log the complaints, but Troy tells me to ignore them unless it's something serious enough to get legal involved. That lined up with what Mitchell had already seen. He could feel the frustration in Rachel's voice. She wanted things to be better, but she had no power to change them. "Has anyone ever quit over it?" he asked. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "A few people. One of the sales guys left because he hated the way customers were treated. Another woman from the front desk quit after Troy yelled at her for helping a customer he called a waste of time." Mitchell kept his expression neutral, but inside, his frustration deepened. Good employees had walked away because of this culture, and no one in leadership had done anything about it. Rachel hesitated again before speaking. Are you from corporate?" Mitchell met her gaze. "Something like that." Before Rachel could ask anything else, Troy's office door opened. He stepped out, scanning the floor until he spotted Mitchell. His expression darkened as he walked over. "All right," Troy said, stopping a few feet away. "I don't know what your deal is, but you've been asking a lot of questions." Mitchell didn't respond immediately. He let the moment stretch, watching Troy's impatience grow. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Mitchell finally asked. Troy frowned, studying him more closely. "Should I?" Mitchell exhaled slowly, then pulled his wallet from his pocket. He took out a business card and placed it on the desk in front of Rachel. "Mitchell Parker, CEO." Rachel's eyes widened as she read the name. Troy, however, took a few extra seconds to process it. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something approaching panic. "You're joking," Troy said, though his voice lacked confidence. Mitchell folded his arms. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Troy's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced toward the other employees on the floor, as if checking to see if anyone else had figured it out yet. "You've been running this dealership like a personal kingdom," Mitchell said, keeping his tone even. "Dismissing customers based on their appearance, ignoring complaints, letting good employees walk away. That ends today." Troy straightened his shoulders, trying to regain control of the situation. "Hold on, let's not blow this out of proportion. We hit our numbers." "That's what matters, right?" Mitchell shook his head. "Numbers mean nothing if the business is rotting from the inside." Troy let out a forced laugh. "Look, maybe I was a little harsh earlier, but this is just how sales works. You can't waste time on people who aren't serious buyers." Mitchell's patience was wearing thin. "The man you turned away today had cash. You didn't even give him a chance." Troy waved a hand dismissively. "Okay, so maybe I misjudged that one. But come on, you can't expect us to cater to every random guy who walks in here looking like he just crawled out of a basement." Mitchell's voice dropped in temperature. "I built this company by treating every customer with respect, no matter what they looked like. That's why we grew. That's why we succeeded, and you've been tearing that apart." Troy's confidence wavered. All right, maybe we need to tweak some things. I can work on that." Mitchell shook his head. "It's too late for that. You're done here." Troy's face paled. "Wait. You're firing me." Mitchell didn't hesitate. "Effective immediately." Troy's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around as if expecting someone to step in and back him up, but no one did. The other employees had stopped what they were doing, watching the exchange in stunned silence. "You can't just," Troy started, but Mitchell cut him off. "I can and I am." Troy exhaled sharply, anger flashing in his eyes. "You're making a mistake." Mitchell didn't waver. "The mistake was letting you run this place for as long as I did." Troy clenched his jaw, then turned and stormed toward his office. A few moments later, the door slammed shut. Mitchell let the silence settle before turning back to Rachel. "Who's the most senior salesperson here?" he asked. Rachel hesitated, then pointed toward a man near the back of the showroom, a middle-aged guy with a calm demeanor who had been watching everything unfold. Mitchell nodded and walked over. The man straightened as he approached. "You've been here a while?" Mitchell asked. 7 years, the man replied. Mitchell studied him. "You ever agree with the way Troy ran things?" The man shook his head. "Not once." Mitchell extended a hand. "Congratulations. You're interim manager." The man blinked, then took Mitchell's hand in a firm shake. "I'll run this place right," Mitchell nodded. "I expect nothing less." He turned back toward Rachel. "And you've been doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. That doesn't go unnoticed." Rachel looked uncertain. I wanted things to be better." Mitchell nodded. "And now they will be." With that, he turned to the rest of the showroom. Every employee was still watching him, waiting to see what would happen next. "This dealership is going to change," Mitchell said, his voice carrying across the floor. "Starting today, customers will be treated with respect, employees will be valued, and anyone who thinks otherwise can find the door." No one said a word, but in Rachel's eyes and in the eyes of the new interim manager, Mitchell saw something he hadn't seen in this place before. Hope. Mitchell didn't waste any time. With Troy gone, there was no reason to let the dealership continue running under the same broken system. He pulled the new interim manager aside, leading him to the office that had just been vacated. The space was a mess, but that didn't matter right now. Mitchell gestured for the man to sit. "You've been here long enough to know what's wrong," Mitchell said. "Tell me in detail what needs to change." The man didn't hesitate. "The pressure to hit numbers has been the only thing that mattered." Troy drilled that into everyone. If a customer wasn't an obvious sale, they were ignored or pushed out the door. No one was allowed to build real relationships with buyers. Mitchell leaned forward. "What about the employees? How were they treated?" The man exhaled. The sales team was constantly pushed to meet quotas, but there was no real support. If you struggled, you were either ridiculed or threatened with being replaced. And as for the front desk staff, they were treated like background noise except when Troy decided they were in the way. Mitchell absorbed the information. It confirmed everything he had seen and heard. "That ends now," Mitchell said. "Effective immediately, no more targeting customers based on appearance. Every person who walks through those doors gets treated with respect. If they're here, they're a potential buyer, period." The man nodded. "That's how it should have been from the start." Mitchell continued. "I also want a full review of the sales team. I need to know who's been following Troy's lead and who's been trying to do the right thing despite him." The man hesitated. "There are a few salespeople who bought into Troy's way of doing things completely. They don't see anything wrong with it." Mitchell's expression hardened. "Then they won't have a place here much longer." He stood. "I'll be personally overseeing this location for the next few weeks. I want to see firsthand who's willing to adapt and who isn't." The man nodded. "Understood." Mitchell left the office and returned to the showroom floor. He spotted Rachel near the front, assisting a customer. She caught his eye briefly before returning her focus to the person in front of her. That was a good sign. She wasn't just standing around waiting, she was already doing the work. Mitchell walked over. "How's it going?" he asked. Rachel glanced at him, then at the customer. "We're looking at financing options right now." He liked the sedan out front. Mitchell turned to the customer. "Glad to hear it. Let me know if there's anything we can do to make this process easier for you." The customer smiled. "I appreciate that." Mitchell nodded, then stepped back, letting Rachel handle things. He had no doubt she was capable. As he moved toward the center of the showroom, he spotted one of the salesmen from earlier, the one who had dismissed the man in ragged clothes. He was standing near a row of vehicles, shifting uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what to do now that Troy was gone. Mitchell approached him. "You've been working here a while, haven't you?" The salesman's posture stiffened. "Yeah." Mitchell didn't let the silence linger. "You turned away a paying customer today." The salesman's jaw tightened. "Troy always said not to waste time on people who weren't serious buyers." Mitchell's expression remained neutral. "That's not how we do business. Not anymore. If you're going to stay here, you'll need to change how you approach customers." The salesman hesitated. Mitchell cut him off. "I don't need excuses. I need to know whether or not you can change." The salesman swallowed hard. "I can." Mitchell studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Then prove it." With that, he stepped away, leaving the man to decide whether he truly meant what he said. Over the next few hours, Mitchell remained on the floor, watching how employees interacted with customers now that Troy was gone. Some were clearly relieved, adjusting quickly to the shift in leadership. Others struggled, hesitant about what this meant for their future. By the end of the day, it was clear who was willing to adapt and who wasn't. Mitchell made mental notes, knowing that in the coming weeks, further changes would need to be made. Before leaving for the evening, he called a brief meeting with the staff. "This dealership is going to run differently from now on," he said, looking at each employee in turn. "Customers come first. Every single person who walks through these doors deserves respect. If you can't commit to that, this isn't the place for you." He let the words settle before continuing. "There will be more changes in the days ahead. Some of them will be difficult. But if you're willing to work towards something better, I promise you, this place will be stronger than it's ever been." A few employees exchanged glances, some nodding in silent agreement. Mitchell met Rachel's eyes one last time before dismissing the group. She gave a small, determined nod. As he walked out the door, Mitchell knew one thing for certain: this dealership had been broken, but now it had a chance to be something better, and he would make sure it happened. The next morning, Mitchell arrived at the dealership before the doors opened. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few employees trickling in, their faces a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. He had given them a lot to think about the day before, and now it was time to see how they responded. He walked inside, nodding toward Rachel at the front desk. She looked more confident today, her posture straighter, her expression less guarded. That was a good sign. Across the showroom, the interim manager stood near the service bay, speaking with a mechanic. Mitchell waited until he finished before approaching. "How are things looking this morning?" Mitchell asked. The interim manager exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Some of the sales team is nervous. They're used to doing things Troy's way. A few of them are still figuring out if they even want to stay under the new rules." Mitchell expected that. He had no illusions that everyone would fall in line immediately. Anyone pushing back outright. The interim manager nodded toward the far side of the room, where the salesman from the previous day stood with his arms crossed, deep in conversation with another employee. "He's the most resistant. Thinks this new approach is going to tank sales." Mitchell watched the salesman for a moment. The man's body language was stiff, his jaw tight as he spoke. It was clear he was still struggling with the shift. "We'll see how he does today," Mitchell said. "If he can adapt, great. If not, we'll need to make another change." The interim manager nodded in agreement. Mitchell turned his attention to the rest of the dealership. A few employees were already engaging with customers, their approach noticeably different from the previous day. There was less hesitation, less of the quick dismissals he had seen before. It was progress, but it wasn't enough yet. He moved toward the service desk, where a customer was speaking with a technician about an issue with their vehicle. The conversation seemed straightforward, but Mitchell wanted to hear firsthand how the service department operated under the new expectations. "What's the issue?" Mitchell asked as he stepped beside the technician. The customer, an older man with worn hands and a tired expression, glanced at Mitchell before answering. "Transmission's acting up. Been getting worse for a few weeks." The technician looked between them, a little unsure of how to respond to Mitchell's presence. "We can run diagnostics, but depending on the damage, it might be a costly repair." Mitchell nodded. "Make sure he gets a full breakdown of options. If there's a way to save him money without cutting corners, let's find it." The technician hesitated before giving a small nod. "Understood." The customer looked at Mitchell, eyes narrowing slightly. "You the new manager?" Mitchell considered the question for a moment before answering. "Something like that." The man gave a small grunt, then turned back to the technician. "Long as you're not trying to upsell me on something I don't need, we're good." Mitchell watched as the technician led the customer toward the service bay, then turned his attention back to the showroom. Across the room, the resistant salesman was now with a customer, though his approach lacked the confidence he had displayed the day before. He wasn't outright dismissing the man, but there was a stiffness in the way he spoke, as if he were holding back frustration. Mitchell walked over, stopping just within earshot. The customer, a middle-aged man in a simple jacket and jeans, was asking about financing options. The salesman's responses were clipped, lacking enthusiasm. "You're sure you don't want to look at something more affordable first?" The salesman asked. The customer hesitated. "I've already looked at my budget. I know what I can afford." The salesman sighed quietly, then began running through the financing details without much effort to explain them clearly. Mitchell stepped forward. "Would you like someone to walk you through the options in more detail?" The salesman stiffened, recognizing Mitchell's voice instantly. The customer, on the other hand, nodded. "That would help, yeah." Mitchell gestured toward Rachel, who had been listening nearby. "Rachel, can you assist?" She immediately stepped forward, taking over the conversation seamlessly. As she guided the customer toward a desk, Mitchell turned back to the salesman. "You didn't even try," Mitchell said, his voice even. The salesman's jaw tensed. "I was just trying to make sure he didn't waste his time on something out of his range." Mitchell's expression didn't waver. "That wasn't your decision to make." The salesman exhaled sharply, frustration clear in his posture. "I don't know how to do this your way." Mitchell studied him for a moment. "Then you have a choice. Adapt or move on." The man looked away, his hands tightening into fists before he finally muttered, "I'll think about it." Mitchell didn't push further. Some people needed time to adjust. But if the salesman couldn't change, he wouldn't last long here. As the day went on, Mitchell remained on the floor, watching interactions, stepping in when necessary and reinforcing the new standards. Slowly, the dealership began to shift. Customers lingered longer, employees listened more attentively, and the energy in the room felt less tense than it had the day before. By mid-afternoon, a familiar face walked through the door, the man in the ragged clothes from the previous day. Mitchell immediately stepped forward, greeting him with a handshake. "I'm glad you came back." The man gave a small nod. "Figured I'd see if things had actually changed." Mitchell gestured toward the vehicles. "Let's find you the right car." This time, there were no dismissive glances, no skeptical looks from the staff. Rachel stepped in to assist, walking the man through his options with genuine care. By the time the deal was finalized, the atmosphere in the dealership had shifted entirely. Employees who had been hesitant before now saw firsthand what the new approach could accomplish. As the man signed the final paperwork, he looked at Mitchell. "Didn't expect this place to turn around that fast." Mitchell gave a small smile. "Neither did I, but it's only the beginning." As the man drove off in his new car, Mitchell looked around the dealership, seeing for the first time what it could become. The work wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, it was on the right track.